a little bit about Kim Scott, best-selling author of Radical Candor, which basically changed Silicon Valley, not enough.
Not nearly enough.
Not nearly enough. And the rest of the world. She's got a new book out. It's called Just Work, and it's about creating an environment where people can actually just work. And she was the CEO coach to companies that you may have heard of, like Twitter, Dropbox, Qualtrics, and many more. She held leadership positions at Google and Apple, those two little guys. And she even managed a pediatric clinic in Kosovo and started a diamond cutting factory in Moscow. So Kim, whoa. Let's start by just tell people a little bit about what Radical Candor is, why you wrote it, why you think it was important for the world to read this book.
So why don't I start by just telling a simple story that illustrates Radical Candor about a moment when my boss criticized me, not because Radical Candor is all about the boss criticizing the employee. Radical Candor should always start with soliciting feedback, and it's more about praise than criticism. But these are the kinds of moments that we're all nervous about. So I had just started working at Google, and I had to give a presentation to the founders and the CEO about the AdSense business. And I walked into the room, and there in one corner of the room was one of the co-founders on an elliptical trainer, stepping away wearing toe shoes and a bright blue spandex unitard. Not really what I was expecting to see there or wanted to see. And then in the other corner of the room was the CEO who was doing his email, and he was so intent on his computer, it was like his brain had been plugged into the machine. So probably like all of you in such a situation, I felt a little bit nervous. How was I supposed to get these people's attention? Luckily for me, the AdSense business was on fire. And when I said how many new customers we had added over the past couple of months, the CEO almost fell off his chair. What did you say? This is incredible. Do you need more marketing dollars? Do you need more engineering resources? So I'm feeling like the meeting's going all right. In fact, I now believe that I am a genius. And when the meeting was over, I walked out of the room past my boss, and I'm expecting a high five, a pat on the back. And instead, she says to me, why don't you walk back to my office with me? And I thought, oh, wow, I have screwed something up, and I'm about to hear about it. And she began not by telling me what had gone wrong in the meeting, but what had gone right, what had gone well. And not in the feedback sandwich, I think there's a less polite term for that, but not in the sort of kiss me, kick me, kiss me sense of the word, but really seeming to mean what she said. But of course, all I wanted to do was hear about what I had done wrong. And eventually she said to me, you said in there a lot. Were you aware of it? And with this, I kind of made this brush off gesture with my hand, because if that was all I had done wrong, who really cared? I said, yeah, no, it's a verbal tic. No big deal, really. And then she said, I know this great speech coach. I bet Google would pay for it. Would you like an introduction? And once again, I made this brush off gesture with my hand. I was like, no, I don't have time for a dumb speech coach. Didn't you hear me? I'm busy. I got all these new customers. And then she stopped. She looked me right in the eye and she said, I can tell when you do that thing with your hand that I'm going to have to be a lot more direct with you. When you say every third word, it makes you sound stupid. Now she's got my full attention. And some people might say it was mean of her to say that I sounded stupid. But in fact, it was the kindest thing she could possibly have done for me at that moment in my career. Because if she hadn't used just those words with me, and this is really a crucial point, she would never have used those words with other people on her team who were perhaps a better listener than I was. But with me, if she hadn't used just those words, I never would have gone to see the speech coach, and I would not have learned that she was not exaggerating. I literally said every third word. It was almost, it was strange to me because I thought I was good at giving talks. I'd raised a bunch of money for 2 different startups, giving presentations. It was almost like I'd been marching through my whole career with a giant hunk of spinach between my teeth, and no one had had the common courtesy to tell me it was there. And this really got me to thinking, what was it about this boss that made it so seemingly easy for her to tell me? But also, more interestingly, why had no one else told me? And as I thought about it, I realized there were sort of 2 things that she did that made it easier for her to tell me. She cared about me, not just as an employee, but as a human being. But she was also willing to challenge me directly. She wasn't going to let her concern for my short-term feelings get in the way of telling me something that I needed to know in the long run. And this doesn't seem so radical, caring and challenging. It seems kind of commonplace. And yet I've never met anyone who doesn't struggle with feedback in some way, shape, or form. So let's get, one of the things I learned in my career is that all of life's hardest problems can be boiled down to a good 2x2 framework. So I'm going to share with you the radical candor framework. So when you do both at the same time, you get radical candor. But sometimes we remember to challenge directly, but we forget to show that we care personally. And this I call obnoxious aggression. In an earlier version of radical candor, in an earlier draft, I call this the asshole quadrant because it seems more radically candid. But I stopped doing that for a really important reason. The reason was that as soon as I did that, people would start using this framework to write names in boxes. And I beg of you, don't use this framework that way. This is not another Myers-Briggs personality test. Use this framework to explain to people, to share with people the exact mistakes that you're making, and to be aware yourself of when you're making specific mistakes in specific conversation. So use this framework to guide those conversations to a better place. Now, the main problem with obnoxious aggression is that it harms other people. And sometimes, by the way, people abuse radical candor. They'll say, in the spirit of radical candor, and then they'll proceed to act like a garden variety jerk. And that is not the spirit of radical candor. That's the spirit of obnoxious aggression. So don't make that mistake, please. But the other problem with obnoxious aggression is that, I don't know about you, but for me, when I realize I've acted like a jerk, my instinct is not to go the right way on the care personally dimension. My instinct is to go the wrong way on challenge directly. And then I wind up in the worst place of all, in manipulative insincerity. This is where passive aggressive behavior, political behavior, this is what, if obnoxious aggression is front stabbing, manipulative insincerity is backstabbing, this is where all the kind of most toxic behaviors enter into the workplace. But the issue is, another issue is that the drama happens in obnoxious aggression and manipulative insincerity. So we talk more about these problems than we do about what happens in this last quadrant, where we do remember to show that we care personally. Most people are actually pretty nice people, despite everything you read in social media. But we're so concerned about not upsetting the other person that we fail to challenge them directly. And this I call ruinous empathy. So that's the TLDR, although it was kind of long, version of radical candor.
So would you say that radical candor, like in a way, is giving feedback in a way that builds someone? I mean, is that another way of talking about that?
Yeah, but I think it's also important to remember it's not it's not only giving feedback. It all starts with soliciting feedback, with making sure that you understand where the other person, what the other person thinks of how you're doing, what you could do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with you. And it also is more about praise than about criticism. And that's part of building. Part of the goal here is to help people grow, to show them what the possibilities are. And praise is a much better tool for that or gratitude, if you prefer, than criticism.
So creating this environment, is it the person who's the manager who should be in charge more of it? Or is it the individual contributor who should set this environment, in your opinion? Same with we'll get to just work, but same.
Yeah. I think it's everyone's job, but it is easiest to put this into practice when the leader is walking the radical candor talk, when the leader is really soliciting feedback and showing to everyone how to respond to it in a way that that sort of rewards the candor. So, other things that leaders can do is they can prevent backstabbing by not allowing one person to come and talk to them badly about another person is really important. There are a lot of important things that leaders need to do. I think the other thing that leaders need to do is to remember that your job as a leader is a job. It is not a value judgment, doesn't mean you're superior to the other people, and that the core of your ability to get things done is a good relationship. And there's nothing more damaging to a relationship than a power differential. So I think another important thing that leaders can do is to sort of lay their power down and get on an equal playing field with others. But if you're an individual contributor, you can also step it up and get on a level playing field. The people I know who've been most successful in their career have been the people who are willing to speak truth to power.
So how would do you have any concrete ways of approaching a boss who, I've actually told you this, that some people say, oh, my boss uses radical candor to just be kind of a bully. So how do you handle that kind of situation?
Yeah, well, I wrote
in the spirit of radical candor, and then they're just, they're saying true things, but it's not in a way that's building anything. So
it's obnoxious. Yes.
Yeah.
Obnoxious aggression or bullying. Very often bias, prejudice, and bullying masquerade as feedback. And those are not legitimate forms of feedback. So if you have a boss like that, here are the things that I recommend. One thing you can do is you can I wrote the second edition of the book, especially because if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of it. And I've heard this often, that often radical candor gets weaponized. So in the second edition, I have a different version of the 2x2 where I call it compassionate candor. And compassionate candor is probably a more clear way of saying what I mean. I don't think it would have sold as many books as radical candor, but it is. So you can use that framework. So here's what you can do if you have a boss who's like that. The first thing you want to do is make sure you're focusing on soliciting feedback. When they say this thing to you that is said in a not in a productive way, but maybe there's an element of truth to it, you want to look for that element of truth, and you want to give voice to your agreement with that element of truth and say, look, you're right. My gray sweater was not colorful enough, and now I bought this orange sweater, and isn't that a lot better? So you want to kind of reward their candor, because you don't want them not to tell you what they think. That's even worse than the sort of ruinous empathy is even worse than obnoxious aggression. So you want to focus on that. And then you want to make sure that you're taking a moment to give voice to the things you appreciate about this boss. Because if this has been happening for a while, you're probably pretty angry if you're like me, and you have forgotten all the things that you appreciate about this person. So I had a friend who was working for a guy who had a reputation as the biggest jerk on Wall Street, and that was saying something. And she adopted this mantra, there is only love. She was not going to talk badly about him to anyone, including her own husband. She was going to give voice to the things she appreciated. But when he did something that was obnoxious, after she had found that little part that she agreed with, she would say, I want to tell you something, is now a good moment. And she would tell it to him to his face as soon as she could after the environment. Say, the way you said that to me was so threatening that you sent me into fight or flight mode. And when my brain is in that mode, I literally can't hear you. So you're wasting your breath, or something like that. So you want to let the person know what the impact that they're having. Because sometimes people are not aware. Sometimes your boss is not aware of of the impact that they're having.
That's a great segue for us to understand where did radical candor moved into just work. So can you tell us how that book came to be and what made you write it?
Sure, absolutely. As I said, if you write a book about feedback, you're going to get a lot of feedback. And some of the other feedback that I got that really, this was the moment when Just Work was probably born. I was giving a presentation to a tech company in San Francisco, And the CEO of that company had been a colleague of mine for the better part of a decade, someone I like and respect enormously, and one of too few Black women CEOs in tech. And after I gave the presentation, she pulled me aside and she said to me, Kim, I'm excited about Radical Candor. I think it's going to help me build the kind of culture I want. But I got to tell you, it's much harder for me to roll it out than it is for you. And she went on to explain to me that as soon as she would offer even the most compassionate, gentle criticism, she would get slimed with the angry Black woman stereotype. And I knew this was true. And as soon as she said it to me, I realized sort of four things at the same time. The first was that I had failed to be the kind of colleague that I imagined myself to be, that I want to be. I'd failed to notice over the course of all this time when we had worked together the extent to which she showed up at every meeting we were ever in together, unfailingly cheerful and pleasant. And believe me, in that period of time, she had what to be ticked off about at work, as we all do. And it had never occurred to me the toll that must take on her. So that was number one. The second thing I realized was that I had been sort of, and this is a hard confession for the author of a book called Radical Candor to make, but I had been kind of in denial about the kinds of things that had happened to me as a woman in the workplace. I think in part because I was uncomfortable thinking of myself as a victim. I think our society treats that notion in a very problematic way. And so I just went through my career pretending like a bunch of stuff wasn't happening that was happening. So that's item number two. Then the third revelation was that I realized even less than wanting to think of myself as a victim, that I want to think of myself as a perpetrator. And I had not come to grips with the biased, the prejudiced, the bullying kinds of things that I myself had done throughout my career. And I needed to come to grips with those. And then the fourth thing I realized was that as a leader, even though I often started companies and built them with the explicit goal in my mind of creating environments where people could love their work and enjoy working together, I had failed to eliminate bias, prejudice, and bullying from the fabric of the culture, and that it was my job to do so. So that was how Just Work was born.
So in the book, and that what personally took me really strong is you tell a lot of personal stories, but especially in the beginning, it really made us trust you because you were brave and you revealed yourself. How did that happen? Was it natural? Was it something, an approach that evolved? Can you tell us more about that kind of process?
You know, it's funny. I've always written in my journal. And when I started writing this book, I tried to sort of have this private moment with myself where I was writing as though I was writing in my journal. So I was just writing, kind of talking to myself. And I always say the second hardest thing about writing is getting inside your own head. The very hardest thing is getting back out. And so I worked with a bunch of different people to help me edit the book and read the book from different perspectives. But I will confess to you that about a week before the book was going to be published, I took a look at that story. I was like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm telling this. And I felt like I felt a little bit nervous, more than a little bit. I was kind of terrified. So, I am one of those people who I would not say I am courageous. Sometimes I have a poor imagination of my own fear. Like for example, one time I went to trapeze school and I was 3/4 of the way up the ladder before I realized I was terrified. And I think this was one of those moments.
You found out too late that.
Yeah, which I'm glad, really, because I think it was helpful to tell the stories.
I think
I was reading those first chapters when I was in the dog park, and I was like, what, and just really, like, Kim really tells all these personal stories that she went through in her vast career, and all these different places, and you can relate to most of them, even though some of them are pretty outrageous. So, but I really want to talk about those three, I guess, ideas of bias, prejudice, and bullying. And how did you come to identifying those three and just really writing about those three? So
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do in this book. So I'm writing a book about workplace injustice, and that feels like such a monolithic, insoluble problem. And with all problems, it's better to break it down into its component parts, solve them one at a time. Whether it's a tangle in your hair or a big math problem. And so I thought about how would I, as I went through even that experience early in my career when I was working in Russia, I was like, it seems like one thing was happening, but actually six different things were happening. So how would I characterize those six different things? And for me, the root causes of workplace injustice are bias, prejudice, and bullying. And a big part of the problem is that we often conflate them as though they're one thing, but these are three very different things. And so I offer some really simple definitions. Bias is not meaning it. It's usually sort of an unconscious, it's not even a belief. It's an unconscious reflection of a stereotype that we don't in fact believe, where it's like a brain hiccup. Whereas prejudice is an actual belief. It's an actual belief that we have that this stereotype is true. It's conscious, and we'll defend it. And whereas bullying is just being mean and often using biases in the world or prejudices in the world to be mean. But there's no belief, conscious or unconscious, in bullying. It's just being mean. And for me, that was helpful. And then when I thought about what happens when you layer power on top of bias, prejudice, and bullying, that's where you get discrimination, harassment, and physical violations.
And when you're confronted with it, you give suggestions on how to deal with those kind of situations, but it takes time to process which one it is. Can you talk a little bit, like a lot of people didn't read the book, so why don't you talk a little bit about some of the advice of what we can do in those? How do you identify it and what you can do? So
yeah, sure, absolutely. So the first, an early chapter in the book is called "What to Say When You Don't Know What to Say." And I think this is part of the problem, at least for me, why I didn't respond. Something happens, I'm like, what? I don't know how to deal with this. So my great grandmother had four daughters, and she needle pointed pillows for all of them. Say something, you can always take it back. So here's like how to start. I don't want to give people scripts because then it won't sound like you. But if you think it's bias, if you suspect it's bias, start with an I statement. An I statement can be, I don't think you meant that the way it sounded. I don't, I am actually the CEO, not the receptionist, whatever. So just a simple correction of fact that invites the other person in to understand things from your perspective. I'll give you an example. And you can use an I statement if you're the upstander as well as if you're the target of the bias. So a friend of mine, Aileen Lee, started a company called Cowboy VC. And she walked into a meeting with two colleagues who were men. And Aileen had the expertise that was going to win her team the deal. And the other side came and sat across the table from them. And the first guy came and sat across from the man to Aileen's left. The next person came in and sat across from the guy to his left. And then they filed on down the table, leaving Aileen dangling by herself. And that's often how bias shows up, just in who we decide to sit next to or across from. So Aileen started talking, and the other side had a question, but they directed it not at her, but at her colleagues who were men. It happened once, it happened twice, it happened a third time. And finally, her colleague stood up and he said, I think Aileen and I should switch seats. So that's an I statement. That was all he had to do to totally change the dynamic in the room. The other side suddenly realized what they had done, but they didn't feel attacked. He was kind of inviting them to notice what they were doing, and things changed. And he did that for a couple of reasons. One was because he cared about Aileen and he thought it was unfair that she was getting ignored in that way. So that's the justice kind of part of just work. But he also did it because he just wanted to win the deal. And he knew if he couldn't get them listening to Aileen, they wouldn't win the deal. So that is an example of an I statement in response to bullying. Now, if it's prejudice, however, an I statement is not going to work because you're kind of, with an I statement, you're kind of holding up a mirror to someone. And if what you're confronting is prejudice, that other person is going to like what they see and say, yeah, that's what I really. So Trier Bryant, who co-founded Just Work with me and who's the CEO, has a story about being in a hiring meeting where they had interviewed about 10 different candidates. By far the most qualified candidate was a Black woman who had worn her hair out naturally in the meeting, in her interview. And everyone agreed she was the most qualified candidate. But the hiring manager said, well, we can't extend her an offer. And Trier said, why in the world not? And the hiring manager said, well, we can't put that hair in front of the business. And believe me, this was not hair was nowhere on the job description. And so an it statement is a better response to something like that because it points out where the line is. One person can believe whatever they want, but they can't say or do whatever they want at work. They can't impose their beliefs on other people at work. So Trier could have appealed to the law. It is illegal not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was in that state. There's a Crown Act. She could have said it is an HR violation not to hire someone because of their hair, which it was at that company. Or she could simply have appealed to common sense. It is ridiculous not to hire the most qualified candidate because of their hair. So that's what to do in the face of real prejudice, which for me, anyway, is way more frustrating and infuriating and enraging than bias is. But what if it's bullying? What if it's bullying? An I statement kind of brings someone closer. If it's bullying, you want to push that person away and you want to use a you statement or a you question. You can't talk to me like that, or what's going on for you here? And my daughter actually taught me this when she was in 3rd grade. She was getting bullied on the playground. And I said to her, I made a mistake that a lot of us make. I said, why don't you tell this kid, I feel sad when you blah, blah, blah. And she banged her fist on the table and she said, Mom, they are trying to make me feel sad. Why would I tell them they succeeded? And I thought, that is a really good point from the mouth of babes. And that was why we sort of came up with a you statement. You can't throw my lunch on the floor or whatever this kid was doing.
Orit, we want to leave. I have to say that once we started talking about Just Work, questions started beaming in. So I want
awesome.
Okay, so let's take them. Okay.
Yeah. And I thought we'll have so many questions around. We won't get to all of them, and some of them are Radical Candor, and some of them are both, and some of them are Just Work. So I'm just gonna start pouring them in. So the first question for Marielle is, how could you be radically candor with your senior leadership?
Yes.
Like PM director for a C-level.
Yeah. It is really, so it's really important, I think, whether you're being radically candid up, down, or sideways, to follow the following order of operations. Start by soliciting it. Don't dish it out till you prove you can take it. So if all of you just do this one thing, think about how you're going to ask for feedback. What is the question that you're going to ask? Because if you say, do you have any feedback for me? You're wasting your breath. I can already tell you the answer. Oh, no, everything's fine. Even though it's your boss's job to give you feedback. Here is my mother, when we used to hike, I was afraid of snakes. And she would always tell me, that snake is way more afraid of you than you are of it. And this is true of your boss. This is the great resignation. Your bosses are terrified that you're going to quit. And I'm getting emails all the time from managers. I'm afraid if I give this feedback, but you are a dead man walking if your boss is not giving you feedback. So you want to, or a dead woman walking. So I'm going to wave a purple flag on myself for biased language. and so you want to make sure that you're asking. Now, the question I like to ask is, what could I do or stop doing that would make it easier to work with me? But that question, you don't want to sound like me. You got to sound like you. So think about how you're going to ask. Here's the elements of a good question. Make sure it can't be answered with a yes or a no. Make sure it sounds like you, and also make sure it works for the other person. I think sometimes we feel like we're being inauthentic if we adjust our communication for the other person. But we're not. That's good communication. So solicit feedback, give voice to the things you appreciate about the boss. You're not in a way that kisses up. You don't want to kiss up, but you do want to remember the things that you like about this person. And then when you want to give some feedbacks, you don't want to start all the way at the outer edge of challenge directly. That's a good way to wind up in obnoxious aggression. So you want to say, I have a couple of things that are on my mind. Is now a good time? And hopefully your boss will say yes. If your boss says no, then find a good time. And if they refuse to have time with you, then polish up the old resume and look for another job. Don't forget to quit is really good career advice. But usually the person will want to hear it. And then start in a gentle way and notice how the person is responding. And if they're sad or mad, that's your cue to move up on the care personally dimension. If they're kind of brushing you off, that's your cue to move out further on challenge directly.
So here we have a question from Antonio, and there's also a few questions like from Guy, and they're all talking about what have changed with everybody moving online, both on Radical Candor and I think Just Work. It's both so relevant. What have changed when we move to remote work, and if there's something we need to notice?
So there's a lot of research. There's Ellen Powell has created this, and her team at Project Include have done some amazing research that demonstrates the extent to which bias, prejudice, and bullying manifest more when we're online than when we're in person. However, the Best Places to Work team has also done some incredible research that shows that people who are underrepresented, and that could be a whole range of different people in different circumstances, but women, for example, are an underrepresented majority, not minority. And so anyway, people who are underrepresented tend to prefer working remotely, that even though they're experiencing more bias, prejudice, and bullying. And so I think that points to a couple of things. One is that the extent to which the workplace does not feel safe, for the physical workplace does not feel safe for people who are underrepresented. The other thing I think that we need to be aware of with both Radical Candor and Just Work is that the kind of context that we usually get when we just walk past by someone on the way to go get a cup of tea or whatever, and we see how we notice. I'm going to wave the purple flag. One of the things I recommend is disrupting bias. Very often I use the word see when what I really mean is notice, and that is ableist language. So when we notice how someone is feeling just by how they look, then or how they're talking, then we lose that online because we're just all in these little tiny squares. And so I think it's really important to be conscious of making sure that we save time at the beginning of meetings. If you have a staff meetings that are 10 people or fewer, to go around the room and sort of connect before we jump into the content and ask people, how are you doing? What's going on for you? And what are you coming into this meeting with? And this was important in the before times when we were in person. It's even more important now because we've lost those little moments of chit chat. And so if we can just use the first few minutes of meetings to connect with one another, we actually not only will we build better relationships, we'll be more apt to be more just and not to give in to our biases, but it's also efficient. We'll just work. Because very often what happens, especially online, is someone comes in and they're scowling. And then everybody else on the line thinks, Kim is pissed off at me. Why is she making those faces? And I'm scowling because I got a new puppy who just pooped on the rug. It has nothing to do with you all. And if you give me a moment to say that, we can actually move. It gives us an opportunity to own our emotions and to show vulnerability. So I think that's really important. The other thing that's really important is to be aware of when it's important to have a synchronous conversation. So anytime you're giving feedback, you should not be sending an email or a text or putting it in a tool. You should be having a synchronous conversation. I used to say, do this in person. That's not possible now. I think it's good to be conscious of whether you want to have a video call or a phone call. There's a lot of research that shows often the phone is better because you're listening to what the person says. And when you're just a tiny little screen, a tiny little square on a screen, we often misinterpret each other's facial expressions and body languages. There's more noise than signal there. And plus there's all these like nobody's very as good as we should be at turning off our notifications. So there's all these distractions. So sometimes taking a virtual walk together and talking on the phone can be a better way to communicate.
We also look at ourselves more than we look at each other on Zoom.
Yeah, if you're having Zoom fatigue, get very rigorous about hiding self-view. It really helps.
So here's a question from Gal Schlesinger. How would you, I think there's a lot of product people here, so I think it's really interesting. How would you adapt your framework when we're talking about cross-functional teams as opposed to organic teams, specifically in cases where there are no leaders in the group or when the leader is not a manager? I think that applies to both books, like the cross-functional and not the hierarchy. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. We talked earlier about how it's kind of easier if a leader rolls out a culture of radical candor. But the fact of the matter is, I think especially as a product person, you are managing a lot of disagreements all the time. And that is really tricky. And in fact, one of the best relationships that I developed when I was at Google started with a disagreement that I was having with a product person. And so it's tempting to think that disagreements are going to pose a challenge to your relationships. But the fact of the matter is, a disagreement held in integrity can actually strengthen your relationship. So you want to make sure that you're following, again, that order of operations. This order of operations applies up, down, and sideways. So here are some things that this product manager, Alad Gill, who's gone on to be quite a famous investor and entrepreneur, he would always ask me, and he was ruthlessly efficient, didn't take a lot of time to do this, but at the end of a meeting, he would ask me, how did that go for you? What could I have done to explain that better? So he's really good at soliciting feedback in the moment, right after we had interactions. And then he was also really good at telling me what he appreciated about what my team was doing. So I was doing sales and operations, and we were sending him data all the time about what was working and not working with the product. And he would tell me when it worked, what to do more of. A big part of radical candor is telling people what to do more of. But he would also tell me equally clearly when what we were doing wasn't working. And he would tell me right away. And that prevented problems from piling up. Like as product leaders, you're probably very aware of technical debt. You should be equally aware of feedback debt. That feedback debt will do to your relationships what technical debt will do to your products. So make sure you're having these conversations quickly and all the time. It's fast, it's free, it just takes enormous emotional discipline. And be aware of how what you're saying and the way you're saying it is landing for the other person. And this doesn't have to take a long time, but do take a minute, because very often I find that product people, you're busy, you have to talk to a bunch of people, and sometimes people are going to interpret what you're saying as obnoxious aggression. So just take that extra moment to say, I know you really care about this, and I think this idea is going to help us both succeed. You don't have to bake cupcakes for everybody, but just take that extra moment to notice the person's humanity, to notice how what you're saying is landing.
I love the feedback depth. That's something that will stick, I'm sure.
Yes.
I'm sure. Also, I found out that if you write the feedback, if you give people to write the feedback and show it, it's much more candor because you don't spare it, but also more contained because you need to put it on paper. Then you have like more behind you.
Yeah, I think you want to be careful of how you're using that sort of script you're writing for yourself, because you don't want it's tempting once you've written it just to email it to the person, and don't do that. But I think writing it, for me, writing it is helpful because it prevents me from wimping out. If I go into a conversation and I know I have in my pocket a Post-it with the 4 things I need to tell the person, I'm much more likely to get to all 4 things, because I'll feel like a wimp if I don't. I'll feel bad if I don't. That to me is the most useful thing about writing it. But it's also good to sort of get your thinking clear. And by the way, do that not just for critical feedback, but also for praise. There was a leader I worked with at Apple, and she said, she would ask the question, how long do you spend time making sure you have your facts straight and your thinking clear before you give criticism? And people, spent time doing that. And then she said, how long do you spend doing the same thing for praise? And people weren't spending any time. And that's why their praise came off as patronizing or insincere. So the more specific and clear you can be about your praise, the better it'll land.
So next question from Yaron. How would you promote the atmosphere for your employees to have radical candor? How would you do that as a leader?
One of the most important things you can do is think about your radical candor story. So at the beginning of this show, I told the story. What is your story? What's that moment in your career when someone told you something that stung a little bit at the time, but stood you in good stead for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Tell that story to your team and use it to illustrate the framework of radical candor. Talk about caring personally, challenging directly. Make sure you explain, how did you know that person cared about you, and in what ways did they challenge you? And then sometimes a shared vocabulary can be very helpful. So make sure that you also explain what obnoxious aggression is, what manipulative insincerity is, what ruinous empathy is. And of course, I have to say this, buy copies of the book for everyone on your team. It'll really help.
That's true.
That's true.
And you can also we made a show. If you all are not readers, we made a movie. We made a radical candor movie called The Feedback Loop.
Also available on Audible. So you can listen to the book.
You can listen to the book. You can do that while you're doing the dishes or weeding and stuck in traffic.
So here's from Claire. I've encountered times when open communication and candor around issues is perceived as negativity, rocking the boat. Do you have any advice for negating workplace cultures that are slow to change? How can we overcome the negativity versus complacency paradox?
Yes. So that is a big reason why people often don't offer radical candor, is because they get accused of being negative. Sometimes there are identity issues that get layered on, like the angry Black woman stereotype, or for me, abrasive. If I had a nickel for every time I've been called abrasive, I'd be doing better right now. So you want to make sure that you do a couple of things. You want to make sure that you are aware of the balance of praise to criticism. You want to remember that if part of what you're trying to do is inspire people about the art of possibility. There's a great book called The Art of Possibility about what's possible. Praise is a really important tool. So make sure that you're giving voice in a way that you're making your listening tangible when people are telling you stuff, so that you're soliciting feedback, and that you're giving. There's research that shows you should give 3 times as much praise, 5 times as much praise, 7 times as much praise as criticism. I don't believe in trying to manage your relationships by a ratio, but I do believe to my core in focusing on the good stuff. So make sure, like, if you're being told you're negative, maybe overall you disagree with the feedback, but look for the 5 or 10% of that's feedback. Don't criticize the criticism. Start by really focusing on the good stuff. But then don't back off your direct challenge. You will not be successful, and your team will not be successful if you get pushed into ruinous empathy or manipulative insincerity. Just move up a little bit on that care personally dimension of radical candor. So state your intention to be helpful before you say the thing. I can tell that you really care about this project, and I have an idea, and I think it'll help you succeed. Like, that doesn't, I'm not saying like give a whole 10-minute preamble, but take an extra beat to get on the same side of the table with people when you're offering critical feedback. In fact, for me, the origin story of radical candor happened in the space of time it took a light to change on the streets of Manhattan. I had just gotten a puppy. I love the puppy. I'm taking her for a walk. I love her so much. I've never said a cross word. She's jumping all over the place. She jumps in front of a cab. I pull her out of the way. In the nick of time, this man, a perfect stranger on the street, looks at me and he says, I mean, I'm standing there with my heart in my throat. And he says, I can tell you really love that dog. That is all he has to do to move up on the care personally dimension. He doesn't have to take me out to lunch or remember my kids' names or know my birthday, nothing like that. I can tell you really love that dog. But he says, you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach her to sit. And then he points at the ground with this kind of harsh gesture and he says, sit. The dog sat. I looked up at him in amazement and he said, it's not mean, it's clear. And then the light changed, and he walked off, leaving me with words to live by. So take a page out of that guy's book. It's not mean, it's clear, but be really clear. Another tip is don't say what you need to say in as few words as possible. Like, when I need to remind my kids to brush their teeth, I don't deliver a lecture on cavities and the dentist. I just say teeth. Because we've already, it's easier. It's hard to hear and it's hard to deliver radical candor. So do it efficiently.
Yeah, we're almost out of time, and we want to be respectful of your time. I wanted you to ask the last questions on your questions. Is that okay?
Which one? Okay.
Number 8.
I guess, which one was, I don't remember that one.
Here.
Oh yeah, I was just thinking, this goes back to just work more and radical candor, I guess. And I was thinking about neurodiversity. Yes, and how, especially like in the tech world,
Yeah.
When people like exchange ideas or exchange feedback, it may sound bullying, but it's not always bullying, because it's just like, there is that neurodiversity thing. And if people don't know what that is, it could be like the autistic spectrum and stuff like that. And a lot of times, like, you ask yourself, well, did they just say that? Or, so I was thinking, were you thinking about that when you wrote that? Is there going to be a third book? Because I feel like these two are like, necessary to read together. And is it going to be a trilogy? So that was my question.
Yeah, there is going to be a third book, but it's a novel in which I fix everything in fiction. So it's going to be sort of a utopian novel. Right. So I think one of the mistakes that people make about just work and about radical candor is they think in order to get this right, you have to have what they call EQ. And I don't think that's true. In fact, for me, many of the people who I've worked with who are most radically candid, who I know care deeply, are in fact on the spectrum, because I'm in tech. I've worked with a number of people who are. So I think part of this is, especially if you care about someone who is on the spectrum, is to give them a heads up about how the way they're talking is landing for others. But don't focus on the negative, focus on the positive. If you're criticizing them for coming across as negative, don't be negative, like, be positive. Sometimes they get it right. Sometimes praise is the best way to help people get this right, but do hold people accountable because they want to get it right. But also, when you're on the receiving end of some feedback from someone you suspect to be on the spectrum, you want to make sure that when you're talking, you want to own 90% of the accountability for saying it in a way that the other person can hear. But when you're listening, you want to assume 90% of the accountability for interpreting how the person is talking to you correctly. And maybe if both the speaker and the listener are assuming 90% of the responsibility for communicating well, we'll communicate okay.
Yeah, this was such a great meetup. Really, I've enjoyed so much. I'm sure Rit did too. Rit,
thank you, Kim. Thank you so much. We really learned a lot. And again, I just want people to know that these two books are really necessary in order to create an environment that is basically like building, and you can really communicate to each other. And this is super necessary in the product world. And that's why I brought you, because these are mostly product people. And I just want to remind everyone that in 3 weeks, I think we have John Cutler coming here, and he's going to talk about the messy middle of creating products. And one of those subjects is communication. So one of those subjects is communication. And I really think that obviously, like even a product evangelist is talking about the necessity of this in our workplace and especially in tech. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So
Kim,
thank you.
Where can people find you?
So justworktogether.com and radicalcandor.com are our websites. And I'm at Kimball Scott on Twitter. And I am ashamed to admit that I tweet daily. I spend too much time on Twitter, but I enjoy it. I always learn something. I just want to end by saying Radical Candor and Just Work, they're both about love and truth at the same time. And those are important values in every culture on the planet. But make sure that you pay attention. Radical Candor and Just Work, they get measured not at the speaker's mouth, but at the listener's ear. So you got to adjust for the culture where you are and for the person, the individual who you're talking to.